my pleasure to welcome you all here to this Jean Monnet lecture on EU-Asia connectivity. Today we will deal with security affairs especially in Europe. However, the implications for EU-Asia relations, for the aspect of connectivity, that is what is of interest here today. The topic, the theme of the lecture is Grand Strategy, European Security and Asia's Role. And it is my pleasure to welcome Sven Biscop. Professor Dr. Biscop is certainly well known to many of you. He is a professor at Ghent University and also the director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels. So he is one of those people who deal with questions of strategy and security affairs on a daily basis, not only from the perspective of an academic working in academia, but also from the perspective of an active think tanker. He is an honorary fellow of the European Security and Defense College and also a regular speaker at the Royal Military Academy in Brussels and also at various staff colleges in Europe and the United States. And also he is regularly invited at the People's University of China in Beijing, where he is a senior research associate as well. I should also mention that he has been honored with the Cross of Officer of the Order of the Crown in Belgium in 2020 and the Grand Decoration of Honor in Austria in 2017. Now, the topic that we deal with here today obviously is framed in the context of Russia's attack, or let's say the ongoing war in Ukraine, and the question whether the grand strategies of great powers, whether they are actually mutually exclusive, or whether the objectives and the underlying interests of the actors can be reconciled. Here, however, it's not only the European theater, so to speak, that we are interested in, but also the role of Asian actors. China obviously is most important here. However, not only because Japan, for instance, is also more and more important, and obviously India as well, when it comes to the question in how far a strategic environment is been structured, and the role of the United States is the one that Sven will also deal with. Now, Sven, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for the invitation, and good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are. My brief this morning is to speak about really the big picture. What are the implications of the ongoing war in Ukraine for world politics, for the world order, if you want, and specifically then what is the place of Asia in this, as seen, of course, from Brussels. Now, I know the temptation is always to declare that after this war nothing will be the same again, and that everything will be changed. However, I've been trained by my academic mentor to always ask the question, well, what is really new here? And of course, one should not take that too far. Things do change, But it is true, I think, that on closer look, often things do not change as much as one thinks. And so, for example, if you ask me, what will the European security architecture look like after the war in Ukraine? So far, my answer is exactly the same as today. You will have the Western part of the architecture, the EU and NATO, which will still be the EU and NATO, but probably a bit more consolidated than before the war. But it cannot be undone because Russia simply doesn't have the power to directly challenge the EU or NATO unless he wants to risk a great power war, which is not the case. Then you have the pan-European, the Europe-wide part of the architecture, notably the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Well, that was paralyzed before the war, and it will remain obviously paralyzed after the war. So the European order, in my view, will not actually change that much. Basically, what is new here is not the Russian invasion. We've seen the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and an invasion of Georgia in 2008, but rather the EU's and the United States reaction to that invasion. That is of a different order. So that's very briefly on the European level. Now, at the global level, here too, actually, so far still, my best guess is that the post-Ukraine war world order will look very much like the pre-Ukraine world order, by which I mean that its primary characteristic is that it remains a multipolar world. By that I mean that there are different poles, different powers or great powers. Some of these poles work closely together, whereas they have more fraught relations with other powers. But in the end, every power pursues its own interests, pursues its own priorities, and no power will allow even its closest partner to determine its relations with another power. To put it frankly, or to put it clearly, China will not let Russia decide what China's relations with the EU or with the United States will be. It is far too important for that. China just pursues its own course. Why is this important that the world remains multipolar? Because the alternative is a return to a bipolar world, basically to a new Cold War, two hostile blocs, Europeans and Americans against Russians and Chinese, two blocs that would decouple and limit their, or maybe end their economic, political, cultural, and academic exchanges. Seen from Europe, that would be very detrimental for our interests, because it would make it impossible to have a successful climate policy if two halves of the world don't talk anymore. It would be an economic catastrophe for the EU, but also would relegate Europe once again to the role of a secondary actor, a sort of permanent deputy sheriff of the United States, but this time in a secondary theater also. I mean, the Cold War, the point of the Cold War was who controls Europe, but the point of a potential future Cold War will be who controls Asia. So seen from Brussels, we Europeans definitely have no interest whatsoever in doing anything to provoke a new Cold War. Of course, if it happens, we will have to adapt to it, but we have no interest in stimulating that. There definitely was a risk that the world would evolve towards a new Cold War. Relations between Russia on the one hand and the US and the EU on the other hand had been bad since 2014 and have now reached an all-time low since the end of the Cold War, but also relations with China. I mean, Sino-American rivalry is the topic of the day, but China's relations with the EU had also been deteriorating in the last couple of years. So the risk was there and the risk remains, but for the moment, the world remains multipolar. And that is basically a consequence, I would say, of China's attitude towards the Ukraine war. Had China decided to back Russia to the extent that the EU and US have decided to back Ukraine, that would have been a tipping point, I think. Then we would have fallen into a new Cold War. But that's not what happened. Instead, China remains basically in the middle. Surely its rhetoric is very close to Russia. But if you look at the practice of its policies, it's rather a policy of non-intervention. China is definitely not cutting back its relations with Russia, but it's also not doing something more really to to support Russia. So China stays more or less in the middle, and that is very much in the EU's interest to keep it there, to avoid this slide towards bipolarity. There are those who advocate that somehow we should threaten China into adopting sanctions against Russia, and that if necessary, we should use sanctions against China to force it to do so. But I fear that this is totally unrealistic. It will be counterproductive, I fear. We'll just push China in Russia's arms, but most importantly, we don't have the economic power to do this. I think that the West has launched a major geo-economic offensive against Russia, but we cannot do this against China at the same time. Then the economic consequences will be too dire. So I would say it's already very good seen from Brussels that China adopts the position that it has. I don't think we can expect more, because China and Russia have a strong mutual interest. They perceive a world that is dominated by the United States, and they will always support each other against the United States. At the same time, their interests to some extent diverge as well. I mean, China is pursuing a strategy that is mostly politico-economic, and that does require a degree of stability. Russia, however, for the last 10 years or so, has opted for a strategy that is much more politico-military and that consciously creates instability. And it seems Russia has decided that with the types of instruments that it has at its disposal and with its kinds of resources, it can make the most out of them in instability. And so that is why the Russian interventionism often clashes with the Chinese interest. I think China welcomes interventions that create stability, like in Kazakhstan last year, but an intervention that creates massive instability, as in Ukraine, is definitely not welcomed by Beijing. We will never know to which degree Putin gave prior warning to Xi of the invasion. There are indications that probably he did say military action was coming, but not quite at which scale, and that China is surprised by the scale of the invasion, and definitely also surprised by the economic shockwave that the West's geo-economic measures are chasing through the economy. So my hunch is that Beijing is not really pleased with Russia. But I always quote Dmitry Trenin, who talks about China and Russia and says China and Russia will not always stand with each other, but they will never openly go against each other. And that is exactly what we see here. So the point is, the world remains multipolar, and that's good because the alternative is bipolarity, but it will not be easy. A multipolar world will be a very complex world. And you can see that it's exemplified by the actions of another Asian power, India. Many people in the West criticize China for not dropping Russia over the Ukraine war, but India has not dropped Russia either. In fact, India goes much further than China, and it has even increased its energy imports from Russia. But somehow it receives less criticism for it because India is a democracy and is therefore seen as a partner or a potential partner of the West. But the reality is that in such a multipolar world, we will have to adapt to complexity. I think Europeans and Americans are always tempted by Manichaeism, to divide the world in good and evil, and specifically to picture world politics as a confrontation between the Democrats and the autocrats. And you've certainly all seen this narrative of somehow Ukraine being the battlefield of democracy against dictatorship. I mean, that is true in the sense that we have a Russian authoritarian state that has invaded a Ukrainian democratic state, but at the global level, it is not true. In my view, world politics is not driven by a clash between dictators and democrats. It's not driven by values. World politics is driven by interests. And states pursue their interests, cooperate with any other state with whom those interests coincide, quite regardless usually of the domestic political system of that other state. So we Europeans and Americans will have to learn that in a complex multipolar world, states that we see as partners, specifically other democracies, will not actually support us on every issue. Whereas at the same time, autocracies, to whom many are intuitively more suspicious, may actually be on our side on certain dossiers. And indeed, it is very counterproductive to promote this democracy versus autocracy narrative, because the reality is that the EU and the US need some of the other autocracies, I mean, not Russia, but the other autocracies on our side, if only because all the natural resources that we have now stopped importing from Russia, well, we will have to import them from somewhere else. And sadly, quite a few of the world's natural resources seem to be concentrated in other authoritarian and or fragile states. So my conclusion is that of this point, that in a multipolar world, yeah, you cannot just have a negative story. The EU and the US cannot go around the world and say, we're against Russia, therefore you have to support us. Lots of states have other problems. Many states in Africa, the Middle East have been at war for years, and nobody cares in Brussels or Washington. So we cannot expect those countries now to wholeheartedly support us because we care about Ukraine. Many countries also feel that, yeah, sadly, unfortunately, great powers sometimes do what great powers do. And you hear states saying, well, in 2014 and 22, Russia invades Ukraine. 2003, the US invades Iraq. It's a shame, but there it is. And we do not feel the need to pronounce on this either way. So just the negative story is not sufficient to mobilize support. The EU and the US can certainly not go around the world and say we are against China, because other states will say, well, yes, but China gives us this, that, and the other. What are you offering us? So my point here is that we need to complement our negative narrative. We need, of course, to clarify what we are against, but we also very much need to say to other countries, well, what are we for? What are we in favor of? What are we offering to the world? What's our positive contribution that you can expect from us and for which you have to support us? And this operates at two levels, bilateral and multilateral. At the bilateral level, the EU has recently announced in last year's State of the Union the Global Gateway, basically the EU's answer to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think this is urgently needed, that we have our own strategic investment projects in other countries, mostly aimed at Eurasia and Africa. The idea is to say to other countries, look, we don't expect you to kick out China. I mean, that would be rather hypocritical, since we too want to continue to deepen our economic relationship. But we want to say to other countries, be smart, like any investor, and diversify. Don't put all of your eggs in the Chinese basket. Here's a nice European basket, nice European investment proposal, and put some of your eggs there. And we will focus on areas such as, about connectivity, of course, in areas such as digital, energy, but also health, food, and I am happy to say research and academia. It is really important that we do this now, that we put money into this, because as you may know, this is the second time that the EU has announced this. Already some years ago, we announced the EU-Asia connectivity strategy, it was then called, which was inaugurated with a lot of fanfare in Brussels and with the visit of Prime Minister Abe of Japan. But then in the end, not so much happened with it. So now it's already the second attempt, if you want, to launch this initiative. Well, now we must really do it and invest the money in it to make it happen. What we should not do is overload the agenda. If we say, here's the global gateway, here's a beautiful investment offer, but you can only take it up if you become a European-style democracy, then it will not work. Because in many cases, China is already there, and we're coming late or we're catching up. Then too many governments, I fear, will say, well, sorry, but then we're not interested. So we should not overload this with political conditions, but we can, in a more technocratic way, if you want, try to have an impact on people's life by saying, if we implement an investment project, we will respect standards, safety standards, of course, health standards, transparency standards, but also ecological standards, social standards, labor conditions, and so on and so forth. So really, this is very strategic. This is about the EU regaining or maintaining influence in countries that it sees as being of key interest, and we must now quickly roll this out. The other level is the multilateral level. And here I think, and this will be my final point, the role of the EU, the positive project of the EU is to keep the world together, to make sure that we maintain one world order with one core set of rules to which all states and all powers subscribe. Why would they do that? Because it brings the political and certainly the financial and economic stability that they need to pursue their interests. We have a lot more interest in keeping states like China inside the global order rather than pushing them out or them leaving and then trying to undermine it from the outside. This will require compromise. Basically, the world order was created by the UK and the US in 1944-45. That, in my eyes, does not render it less legitimate because afterwards everybody voluntarily signed up to it. But if now we have to adapt the rules to new circumstances, or we have to write new rules in new policy areas, such as climate, of course, we will not quickly write the rules between Brussels and Washington. We'll have to find a compromise, certainly at the very least with Beijing. The difficulty is that there's no point in compromising with Beijing if then Beijing does not stick to the rules. Then we might as well not do it. So, and how does one keep Beijing to the rules? So here's the difficulty. And so a lot, of course, will also depend on the future evolution of China's strategy. I think many in Europe still think that the modus vivendi with China is possible because they do not see it as an aggressive military expansionist power. But if China would make that move, and the first time that China would use military force to pursue its interests, that would radically alter everybody's perception, even in Europe. And then Europeans too, would probably begin to see China only as a rival, rather than as today as a rival, a competitor, and a partner all at the same time. Still, China may choose to go this way, and then we'll have to react to it. We definitely have no interest in ourselves creating this bipolarity. So we must stick to our project of one world, trying to keep everybody in, including Russia. Russia has now, for the time being, put itself outside the rules, but our long-term aim should be to return it to the fold of nations with which one can have constructive relationship. This may take a long time. It may even take a change of president in Russia, but we should not lose sight of this overall goal. So I think for the EU, this is its role as an international player, as a great power, as I optimistically say. It's to position itself as the great power that is willing to cooperate, that is willing to work with any other power that gives it something to work with, a sort of mediating constructive role, if you want. The only thing that the EU should know is that this constructive role demands power. You cannot operate in a world of great powers if you don't unite as EU to be a great power yourself. And as we all know, that will be quite a challenge. So lots of work to be done. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Sven, for your talk and for your description of the international system in terms of a realist world in which interests are the driving force for behavior and for the formulation, implementation of foreign policy. And then again, you're quite optimistic when it comes to the role of the EU in that in this world, because your key argument is, as long as the world stays in a multipolar state, that is to say, as long as there is no new bipolarity, then the EU can play out its all its comparative advantages. It needs power, though, and it also needs agency. And I'm wondering whether the aspect of well, normative power, the aspect of values, whether this isn't something that we also need to bring in here more prominently in order to understand and to describe the EU's role. When you for instance look at relations with China, the People's Republic of China, then human rights are increasingly well, regaining importance. So what is your take here on this relationship, especially for an actor like the European Union, the relationship between power and norms, between interests and norms?
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. I'm afraid I become quite skeptical about our leverage to promote norms. I would distinguish between human rights promotion overall and democratization specifically. I think, frankly, we can forget about democratization. I do not think we have the leverage to change anybody's domestic political system, except countries that want to join the EU. But that's, of course, a finite number. Now, when it comes to human rights overall, I fear that certainly towards other powers, we also don't have the leverage to force them to change their domestic policies, especially not on topics that they themselves regard as being of vital interest. To make it very concrete, whatever the EU does or does not do, China will not therefore change its policies towards the Uyghurs, right? And it's a horrible mistreatment, but we have no leverage over that. So my position is therefore that we would do better to keep our powder dry. China is a repressive autocracy, just like Russia. You can invent new reasons for human rights sanctions every day, but it will not make a difference. So I would say, on the one hand, we have a duty as Democrats to call out human rights violations whenever and wherever we see them and to criticize them. But we don't have the moral duty to always link sanctions to them, because they will not work anyway. So I will reserve effective sanctions for when a country like China or now Russia go too far in their foreign policy rather than in their domestic policy, and when they violate the rules in their foreign policy and directly affect our interests. Because the point is, in terms of interest, whatever happens or does not happen to the Uyghurs, again, to put it bluntly, does not affect the European interest very much. So it's a bit of in between position, I would say. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. We are also the audience, right? Having listened to your talk, is also putting questions, and I encourage all of you to do so, please. There are questions pointing to the European policy vis-a-vis Asia, and also the role of actors there. And one question is whether the Europeans shouldn't concentrate on building stronger partnerships with Asian countries in order to respond to these to this realist world that you describe, especially with regard to Southeast Asia and ASEAN, for instance, but also Australia, India, and Japan. What is your take here? How actually can the EU gain the needed power that you refer to in order to play the role that it has to, if it doesn't want to become a secondary power again, as you have mentioned.
Yeah, and I'll try to play into the questions also that I'm reading here. I mean, as EU, we ought to count ourselves lucky that for the moment, a lot of the positioning of the powers towards each other takes place in geo-economic terms rather than in military terms, because in the economic sphere, the EU is the most integrated. It is a supranational entity and it works best. I mean, it doesn't work perfectly, but who does? But it works best. So we are, we are learning fast, I think. And we are beginning to play this geo-economic game. Of course, we are hampered by lack of political unity, that goes without saying. And our military power is actually very big. It's always a bit counterintuitive. It's 1.2 million men and women in uniform and 250 billion a year. But the output generated by that input is far too small because of the fragmentation. So it's not that we have no military power, but it ought to be much more, given what we invest on it. And we have initiatives of the EU now to try to improve this. But I would say it is spearheaded by the Global Gateway, and then we need to add political partnership to that, but even defense partnerships, not everywhere in the world, but I think a bit counterintuitively, part of the EU's unique selling proposition, not so much in Asia, but in Africa, is that we can actually offer a defense partnership, right? I mean, again, to make it very clear, if you're an African government and you need military help, not just equipment and training, but someone who joins you in combat to combat your local insurgents, who are you going to call? You may call Washington, but they seem to be less interested in that. You could call Moscow and hire some guys from the Wagner group, or you call Paris or Brussels. And it's quite a very sensitive instrument, but it's something that we can do. You do not call Beijing, right? Because Beijing will not send you a brigade to go into combat. That's what they will do. So something to play on. And it plays into the question by Anna Shvakovskaya. Indeed, I think the approach will have to be modulated dependent on the region. I think in Africa, there is great scope for the Global Gateway. In Central Asia, probably less, given that those countries are already trying to keep a middle ground between Russia and China, which does not mean that we should just remain absent there. But I see great scope, and you mentioned that, Sebastian, specifically in Southeast Asia also. Now, in my view, because someone asked this question, should we not focus more on India, Japan, South Korea, and so on, rather than on China? I would still do both, right? So for me, it's not either or. We have to invest in our relations with all Asian countries, including China. And again, for the moment, I do not see China as a revisionist power, in the sense that I don't think it's trying to undo the world order. I think it's trying to gain more power within the current world order, which suits its fine. So I do think we have to still try to work with China, but as I said, a lot of course will depend on the future evolution of their policy. And the more confrontational they become, the more they will push the EU and the US closer together, and we will get into this narrative of rivalry, which would be very counterproductive. My view is that the Chinese have actually seen from, if I try to reason from the Beijing point of view for a moment, difficult, but I try, is that they have missed quite a few chances to drive a little wedge between Europeans and Americans, probably because of a certain arrogance, a certain hubris. Europeans, they follow the money anyway, so don't need to take too much into their feelings into account, which is not totally wrong, but it only goes so far. And if you exaggerate and you push too hard, then people will actually revert to the values and prioritize that over the money. So I hope that we may see in the future a somewhat more constructive attitude from China again. Thanks.
Yeah. you mentioned, you referred to the United States, and there is a question here with reference to the Indo-Pacific. And now recently, the White House has come up with its economic framework for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And there is the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States of America. All of this is very much interpreted as a overall strategic approach that shall impede on a more assertive China and its rise. So possibly even kind of containment. Where does the EU stand here? The EU has a Indo-Pacific has a strategy for the Indo-Pacific as well. Came up with it last year. There are member states, Germany, but also France, Netherlands have come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy as well. How do you assess the Europeans' role when it comes to co-shaping the regulatory frameworks, but also the strategic framework in the Indo-Pacific?
I'm a bit skeptical towards this whole use of the term Indo-Pacific, to be honest. There was an interesting article, but I forget by who, in the latest issue, or one of the days of Survival, the journal of the IISS in London, where someone said, yeah, Indo-Pacific is a term that somehow seems to pretend that China is not there in this region. But of course it is, that's why we're talking about it. But all right, it's a semantic discussion maybe. But I mean, the EU now has an Indo-Pacific strategy, it seems, because everybody had one, and it's the fashionable thing to do. But our Indo-Pacific strategy is more, a hodgepodge of existing strategies and policies with a new title put on top of it. Frankly, I'm not sure what the Indo-Pacific is and whether one needs a strategy for it. I would say we need an Asia strategy. And within an Asia strategy, of course, a strategy towards China, but also towards some of the other countries, rather than specifically an Indo-Pacific strategy. And when we talk about it as EU, to me, it's often not so clear what is the point. On the one hand, we talk about creating a maritime presence in the Indo-Pacific, but what for them? To deter China from doing what? On the other hand, we talk of cooperating with China still in maritime security. So I think there's a bit confusion. So my own hunch is that, this Indo-Pacific label for the EU doesn't make so much sense, and that we should focus on the bilateral relations and the global gateway, that we should focus on promoting rule of law at the regional level through our cooperation with ASEAN, for example, and then of course continue with our China strategy. Someone asked, what do I mean when I say China and the Chinese, and does one really understand that? I mean, I do not pretend to be a China expert because I don't speak the language, so one cannot be a China expert if one doesn't speak Chinese. But obviously, when I mean China, I mean, the Chinese state and party who rule China. Does one sufficiently understand China? There can never be enough understanding of China. And for the moment, this is of course very tricky because in practice, China is closed. You can travel, but you need to quarantine for 3 or 4 weeks, so you don't travel. And that's a great pity that the contacts are a bit cut off. And I would hope that at least academic exchange would resume sooner rather than later, so that we can continue to build this strong understanding between the two. Thanks.
Well, there is staying with the United States here. For the United States, China is, for the foreign policy of the United States, China is the most important challenge in the decades to come, right? This is what the Trump administration well focused on, and the Biden administration has not changed its perception in that sense of the People's Republic of China. Now, with the US focusing on the Indo-Pacific, and do you see that the Europeans are losing out here? Actually, I mean, is it to the detriment of Europe that the United States has turned towards Asia already during the Obama administration, and that the Europeans are yet not up to the challenge in Asia? You said the Indo-Pacific strategy. You don't see the actual well, the concrete structure behind it here. You said that you look at the whole picture, right, at the grand picture. So seeing through the lens of a realist worldview. Isn't that all pointing to a scenario in which Europe is actually playing a secondary role?
In a way, this is a longer evolution, because if you think back to the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, from the very beginning, actually, the United States, even before pivoting to Asia, signal to Europeans, look, the Cold War is over, NATO stays in place, an Article 5 scenario, we are there for you, but all kinds of non-Article 5 type crises around Europe, you are going to have to take care of them yourselves. Huh? But so that message is actually a message of 30 years ago, but Europeans never wanted to hear it. And of course, we were often not prepared, and so the US in the end did intervene in the wars in former Yugoslavia, for example. But time and time again, they keep saying us, you know, if it's not Article 5, you'll be on your own. But the temptation for Europeans is so great to think, yeah, well, whatever happens, in the end, the US cavalry will come and save us, because it's such a comforting thought, right? And if you can convince yourself of that, then suddenly nothing is urgent anymore. And no, we can all go home and have a drink. So that evolution, I think, has just been accelerated. And because in the beginning, it was only about non-Article 5 scenarios, but now we also know that since the pivot, and since for the US, China clearly is a bigger threat than Russia, it now also applies to territorial defense. Meaning we are all very happy now in Europe, rightfully, that the US plays a great leadership role in the Ukraine war. But if there were a war simultaneously in Europe and in Asia, it is quite likely that the US would prioritize Asia, in which case American reinforcements to Europe would probably still come, but they may come later and in smaller numbers than we had counted on until now, which is a strong argument for the EU not to go its own way, but to strengthen, to accept the idea that even within NATO, the first line of defense and deterrence, at least in conventional terms, I'm not talking nuclear, but conventional, will have to be European because of this change in focus of the United States. But so this is in the defense sphere. At the same time, I think in the economic and political sphere, the world has long been multipolar, and the EU has its own agenda. As someone remarks in the questions, of course, it was sometimes difficult for us to mobilize the political unity, but I don't think that we will necessarily be relegated to a secondary role. I think it depends first and foremost on us maintaining our economic power, and in absolute terms, our relative economic power, of course, decline as other states become more economically powerful, and I mean that's in itself not negative. I mean, if other states become more wealthy, that is a positive evolution. But in absolute terms, we should maintain our economic power, and then we will remain a global player that is able to defend its own interest, and I would say to play a leading role within the multilateral system. Because for me, that's ultimately the ideal scenario, let's say, that we have a sort of a concert of the great powers, but embedded within strong multilateral institution, right? So no Congress of Vienna and Holy Alliance, but the great powers that take the lead, but within the multilateral institutions. So leading, but also leading with the other states. And this may seem naive, maybe, and certainly if you look at China from certain aspects, one is definitely very, very worried. But I am not convinced that we are necessarily on a collision course with China. In my view, we have to really learn to distinguish between the fact that we heartily dislike China's domestic political system and its foreign policy. It's not because a state is a repressive autocracy that therefore everything that it does in international politics is illegitimate. A lot of what China does in foreign policy is simply what we also do. But because it comes from China, which we don't like, we criticize it for it. So we really have to distinguish clearly between what are legitimate goals and what are illegitimate goals, what are legitimate instruments and what are illegitimate instruments, and react accordingly, because otherwise I think we're going to alienate also lots of other countries in the world that are not interested in a new bipolarity and that are not interested in choosing sides between us and China. And there is a gray zone, of course, to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate Chinese behavior, but still, I think we should try. Thanks.
Yes, yes. I mean, obviously, this is related to the question of the cohesiveness and the capacity of the European Union to act as a global power, as is also put forward in one question by my dear colleague Jörn Carsten Gottwald here. So, who would be interested to learn more about this aspect? And what comes to mind here as an example is again China, and for instance the case of Lithuania, and the question whether there is a whether the European Union member states' unity is challenged by China to a degree that actually does not allow for a common for that unitarian approach. And suffice to say, and to mention a scenario in which Taiwan becomes the object of a outward military aggression by the People's Republic. Where does Europe stand then, and the EU?
I think the Lithuania case is just like an example of what I meant when China, I think, in a sort of mood of hubris or arrogance, shoots itself in the foot in its relations with Europe. Because in the case of Lithuania, the country pulled out of the 17+1, so now 16+1. I think that's a good decision. I'm not sure to which extent it tried to coordinate with other countries, because it would have been better if some others withdrew at the same time, but I think it's a good decision. The country then decided to open a representative office for the Taiwanese. Yeah, I mean, you know that China will not like it. There's nothing wrong with it. There's one here in Brussels. Then they decided to call it not a Taipei, but a Taiwan representative office. Then I'm thinking, yeah, that is a needless provocation, which doesn't help anybody, and it doesn't help Taiwan either, not really. And it created quite a bit of irritation in Brussels. People saying, yeah, well, would it be nice if you had consulted about that? But then China so massively overreacted against Lithuania that, of course, all of the EU supports Lithuania and the single market. And you saw the same with the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which was announced. And a bit later, there were very symbolic EU sanctions because of the mistreatment of the Uyghurs. And then China again massively overreacted, with the result that China itself broke through the logic of partner, competitor, rival, and ensures that more and more people see it only as a rival. So my message to any Chinese colleague that I meet is always, if you want a more constructive relationship, the ball is in your camp, because it's China that has broken through the logic of compartmentalization, of agreeing on one issue while you disagree on another, seeing China as a partner, competitor, and rival at the same time. Now, I'm not one of those who thought that the war in Ukraine would so easily lead to another war over Taiwan, because China's starting position is very different. I mean, Our relations with Russia are, of course, now at a very deep point, but they were bad already. And we already saw Russia as a power that doesn't hesitate to use military force to pursue its interest. But certainly in Europe, this is not the mainstream image of China. We see China as an enormous political challenge, as a huge economic competitor, but not as a militarily aggressive state. And so the day that China, because China hasn't gone to war since the 70s against Vietnam, more or less. And so the day that China would go to war to pursue its interest, for example, to invade Taiwan, that would be a sea change. Everybody would radically have to turn around their perception of China. So China has a lot more to lose from going to war than Russia. I think the element of unpredictability is there, however, because Taiwan is a symbolic issue. And if a thing is a symbol, it means that the discussion about it is never entirely rational. It becomes emotional. And that creates an element of unpredictability. But I've said long ago, before this war, that the only deterrent that Europe has is the economic deterrent. We ought to say that if China uses military force to alter their status quo on Taiwan, then the economic relationship with Europe can never be the same. And I think now that idea has been lent more credibility, because this is exactly what we did in reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I do think that message has been heard in Beijing. Thanks.
Yeah, well, the element of unpredictability, as you call it, that also comes up with regard to another question, which is focusing on Ukraine and the sanctions imposed with regard to energy by the Europeans. So the question here is, will the Ukrainian war and sanctions on use of Russian gas and oil weaken the EU economic power if the war and sanctions carry on for a long time, if not to say indefinitely, as it's here? Well, indefinitely, yeah. Certainly be a sea change. But economic power is most important. It's the main deterrent, as you've just said, in a realist world, right? This is where the European Union gets its strength from. So how does the Ukraine war impact here? And let me extend that by again referring to the role of India, for instance, when it comes, and others, when it comes to actually buying Russian energy, especially oil.
Yeah, I mean, again, it points to the complexity of multipolarity, that you can wish to isolate Russia, but it's not as isolated as we think. Because in the end, maybe a good 2/3 of states voted against Russia in the UN General Assembly, but by far not all of those actually apply sanctions. So it's EU, NATO members plus some of the usual partners, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, and for some reason the Bahamas, that apply sanctions. And so total isolation is tricky, even in a flagrant case such as this, we know. But we do have the power of our scale. So certainly this will cost us too, and that goes without saying. But it's a price that it's a burden we can carry, and it will force us to accelerate the green transition. So I don't think in the end that this will weaken the EU. In a way, it strengthens the EU because it will force us to adapt our decision-making structures also. Now that we know that if you want to be a global player, that this is this kind of thing that you have to be able to do. What we do have to take into account is that we now become more dependent on the stability of other countries from which we import natural resources. And even the green transition, yeah, we will still remain dependent on many critical raw materials, but they are more evenly spread in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. If I may, one more word to Ambassador Lopez Nadal also. I mean, who says, I don't see how we can deal with a regime that oppresses citizens, practices ethnic cleansing, etc., etc. I mean, on the one hand, you have a point, but on the other hand, we do that all the time. We regard Saudi Arabia as an ally and a partner, and they do exactly the same. Or if you're honest and you look at India, and the militarization of the province of Kashmir, or the government itself that often instills hatred and violence against Muslim citizens. So again, I fear that our interests force us to distinguish between the domestic policies of states, however horrible, and their role in foreign policy. And in foreign policy, we may actually sometimes need them on our side. So I don't think the comparison with Munich stands. Let's not forget why did we did not begin. The other states did not begin to be concerned about Germany because of its domestic dictatorship. It was about its foreign policy, right? And if you look at foreign policy, we're not in a Munich mood, right? I mean, if you look at Ukraine and Russia, we have not dropped Ukraine like we dropped Czechoslovakia in 1938. It's exactly the opposite, right? We have entered the war as a non-belligerent, and we are doing everything to assist Ukraine, short of joining the war. That's exactly the opposite of Munich. So I don't think anybody is in a Munich mood, not towards Russia and not towards China. And so that, I think, is a comparison that is made too quickly. The day that China begins with military expansion, then that question will pose itself. Just one last sentence. I do agree that it has crossed the line in the South China Sea, as Ambassador Lopez Nadal rightly mentioned. And there I fear China in a very clever way, without fearing a shot, has created a fait accompli, de facto military annexation in the South China Sea, that will be very difficult for us to undo, short of going to war. And all we can do is to continue to signal that legally we don't accept it. But there is little that we can do about it, unfortunately. Thank you for that exchange.
There is far more to international relations than military and strategic affairs. Obviously, one aspect is as you have pointed out, is the importance of the economy, and with that comes trade. And here, obviously, a big question is in how far the European Union will be able to strengthen and to expand its trade relations with the countries in the region, and what the role of China will be here, right? I mean, will there be will we diversify away away from what has been called a toxic dependence on China? In many EU member states now, there is a mood that there actually is an over-reliance on the Chinese market. At the same time, China is needed in order to solve global challenges like climate change, for instance. But it's also an important partner when it comes to the question of regulatory frameworks, when it comes to new technologies, and so on. There is need for cooperation while there is rivalry, and I think that this is what defines this new era in which we are living. Because of that, the role of norms and values, they will continue to play an important aspect of policy formulation and policy making. Here we will, I think we will still see more complexity, as you called it, as there has been before. And in that sense, bipolarity certainly was a less complex world. And the question how we get control of this is still out. You mentioned the multilateral level. There are those institutions, for instance, the World Trade Organization. There are others like the G20. However, the the capacity to govern here has reached its limits in many ways. And obviously, the question is in how far the United States of America will be ready to become and will remain an actor here. And that then is a question of domestic politics in the first place, and who's going to be elected in 2 years' time, or if not to say in the midterm elections now this year. So for the EU, there is every reason to increase its agency, to increase its capacity, its unity. Yes, we know that. And then at the same time, there has been Brexit, and there are many forces who inhibit this developments that would actually increase agency on the side of the European Union. And who gains from that? Obviously, that is another question. You make your point clear. That is that multipolarity has has a clear advantage. And I want to thank you for your talk here, also for referring to the questions, and thank you to all of those who put their questions in the chat. We hope that you enjoyed this talk by Professor Biscop, and we're looking forward to seeing you next time here on this channel. The talk will be put on our YouTube channel, on the YouTube channel of the Center for EU-Asia Connectivity and the Jean Monnet Chair. We wish you a good day and a good evening, and all the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.